We've spoken about some of the fascinating ways in which nanotechnology can be used to try to make solar cells that are more efficient, more cost-effective, ideally both. We touched on one concept, the photon trapping concept, in which it's possible to capture light inside a solar cell, give it multiple opportunities for absorption. It turns out that there's another way in which we can use nanoparticles for a similar purpose, and it's a very convenient one from the point of view of fabrication. Let's think back to when we talked about plasmons or plasmonics. At the time we were talking about ways of communicating information across a chip using light, and plasmonics provided a particularly convenient means of conveying information, optical information, and confining light to very small regions. The basis for this was particles of metal that are very small, 10 to 100 nanometers, and we talked about how it was a bit like stepping on stones across a pond or across a river. We'll now think of being perpendicular to those stones and think of being the river. Those stones now look like scattering centers if you're the river. Well, in photovoltaics, there's an emerging effort where people are trying to use metal nanoparticles, these plasmonic particles, in order to scatter light in various directions. So this is analogous in its function to what we do with light trapping. Now, instead of using the spiky silicon interface in order to give light multiple chances to bounce around inside our device, instead we send light in from the sun and it scatters off in multiple directions off of these scattering points that are the metal nanoparticles. What's so convenient is that nanotechnologists know very well now how to synthesize metal nanoparticles, colloidal particles, dispersed in a solution in a solvent, paintable materials, and simply coat them onto things. And so it provides a very ready means of making devices that have a greater capacity to enhance the absorption of light using nanoscale interactions between light and, in this case, metals. We spoke quite a bit about the limitations of making a solar cell having a single junction, having one semiconductor type. And so the obvious solution there is to make a semiconductor device that has many different band gaps. In fact, before the advent of the latest solution processed nanotechnology-based approaches, there had been much work on what are called tandem and triple junction solar cells, and they were very effective in making very efficient devices. The concept looked like this. Semiconductors of different types having different band gaps were grown on top of each other. So, for example, we were able to use compound semiconductors like the gallium arsenide that we heard about in our lecture on optical communications, and grow semiconductors with different compositions. One layer could be made with gallium arsenide, another with indium arsenide. And these different compositions led to different band gaps. Now, these cells offered a real advantage in terms of the efficiency of the device because they allowed us to make a first cell, the one closest to the light, that produced the absorption of visible light primarily. The visible light, as we discussed, had very energetic photons in it, and we used a large band gap in this material. We were able to harvest this portion of the sun's spectrum in a way that gave us a lot of voltage corresponding to the abundant energy in those photons. And only then did we step down to an intermediate band gap layer and then to a small band gap layer. These produced lower voltages, but they mopped up the photons that made it through the visible band gap cell. Now, the design of these tandem and triple junction solar cells is not trivial at all. They're passing a single current throughout this entire structure, but their voltages are adding up. And so they need to be designed in such a way that the current generated within each layer is the same. This challenge is known as current matching. It's a well-known art, but it complicates the design of the devices. But in the traditional triple junction devices, there's an added complication. It's the following. We're trying to grow a perfect crystal, having a single lattice with a defined spacing amongst the atoms. But we're doing it with different materials. And every different material has its own lattice constant. It has its own characteristic spacing amongst the atoms. If each one of these will be a perfect crystal, then how can they be integrated with one another without having slips, without, say, the gallium arsenide having a slip in its lattice periodicity relative to the differently periodic indium arsenide material? Well, the answer is that actually we can't, and that these slips are a problem. They create interfaces, dangling bonds, unpassivated states. They're places where we can lose efficiency or lose reliability in our solar cell. As a result, in making these stacked solar cells, researchers were forced to come up with even more complex materials combinations using 3 or 4 constituent atoms in very specific ratios such that the atoms got spaced out and could be matched. This is referred to as lattice matching. It's effective, but you can imagine that the approach leads to costly solar cells. It turns out there is a venue in which these multi-junction solar cells, even the very costly ones, can be used very effectively. The reason cost ends up being a problem, of course, in solar cells is if we need to have a very large area solar cell, which is normally how we do things. If we cover an entire roof or a building with these kinds of materials, we'll be very sensitive to very large, high costs per surface area. However, there's a field within solar photovoltaics known as concentrating photovoltaics, in which we use optical methods in order to focus light down from the sun onto a very small solar cell. In fact, we're able to achieve very high concentrations in this manner. So instead of operating at 1 sun, we can operate at 100 or 400 or 500 suns. And now, because we've focused the light down onto an individual solar cell that's much, much smaller than the area from which we're catching our photons, we can get away with making a solar cell that has higher cost. So these very efficient, very good in their spectral utilization solar cells do have a place, and it's in concentrated photovoltaics. Here, though, the challenge now on the cost front becomes twofold. The first is that these concentrated photovoltaics have these optical systems that need to focus all the light down onto these solar cells. So there's an additional element. Now we're starting to use some optics and lenses for focusing inside these devices. And that adds some cost. The other component is that now we're looking up at the sun and we're focusing it down to a spot where if we were to tilt our solar cell a bit relative to the sun, or more likely if the sun is passing overhead as a function of time of day, and therefore it's a different angle relative to our device, unless we orient our concentrating optical solar cell just right relative to the sun's rays, we won't end up focusing onto our solar cell. We'll be off focus. And as a result, these concentrated solar cells also require tracking. So they end up having to follow the sun over the course of the day and follow its angle. This can be done. It also creates additional complications in terms of cost and reliability and maintenance of these installations. And so what we would love to do is to be able to achieve these triple junction solar cell efficiencies, these very, very high performance devices, but in a manner that doesn't require the cost and the complexity associated with growing compound semiconductors on top of each other in this lattice matched fashion. And it is this area where we seek high spectral utilization efficiency, full addressing of the sun's broad spectrum, but we combine it with low cost, that some of the most exciting work in nanotechnology-based solar cells is ongoing today. And I'll now talk about 3 examples of broad areas in which people are really pushing the boundaries on using the sun's broad spectrum better through the use of nanotechnology. The first of these is called organic or polymer solar cells. And in my lectures throughout this course, you've heard a lot more about what we call inorganic materials. You've heard about semiconductors like silicon and gallium arsenide, the bases for electronics and for optoelectronics and optical communications, glass as well. And it's more from Shana in her discussions of biology, biomaterials, and biomolecules that you've heard about carbon-containing organic molecules. Well, this field of organic photovoltaics seeks to marry some of the very desirable properties of the organic materials with the urgent need to make solar cells that are much more cost effective. You can immediately think of one of the obvious advantages of moving to an organic approach to making solar cells, which is that they're more compatible with physical flexibility. This is also the way we think about the biological world, that it's bendier than some of these rigid silicon-based solar cells, and that's absolutely correct. And so the early work on making physically flexible solar cells with their attractive properties in terms of low cost of manufacture, convenient deployment, has come from this field of organic polymer solar cells. The organic molecules themselves, this field of synthesis of organic molecules is incredibly well developed. It's the same field that has given us the capacity to synthesize all sorts of new drugs in biomedical applications. It's the same field that has allowed us to generate polymers that we use throughout our life that are integrated into fabrics and that are used to create synthetic rubber. So this field of organic synthesis is incredibly well developed. People who do synthetic organic chemistry know how to make a really broad swath of molecules designed to achieve the precise functions that we desire. Now, in organic photovoltaics, the name of the game, of course, is strong absorption, but also conduction of energy, conduction of electrons along the chains. And here researchers discovered a number of decades ago means of making these organic molecules, which traditionally we thought of as insulators. We hadn't thought of them as electronic materials capable of conduction. They found ways of using the bonds that they could engineer along these chains of polymers and of achieving the delocalization of electrons, where electrons could be everywhere along these chains. Essentially, they found ways to replicate the good qualities of semiconductors and replicate them within this organic system. What they had done is figured out a way to make a molecule that could be scaled up, synthesized in a beaker, cast onto a solid substrate, printed on with an inkjet printer, but where the molecule could function as a semiconductor. This obviously is a powerful platform for thinking about how to make low-cost solar cells. Now, the other component, of course, of making a good solar cell is to think about the way it utilizes the sun's spectrum. And there are some advantages to the organics on this front as well. In particular, researchers are able to design and define the function, the optical resonances of these materials to lie somewhere in between the properties of individual atoms and the properties of semiconductors. Recall that in the case of individual atoms, we have these very discrete levels. In the case of semiconductors, we spread those levels out into bands. Well, the organic molecules are kind of in between those two length scales spatially. They're typically a few nanometers in size. And these very, very well-defined, tight, discrete energy levels characteristic of the atoms, researchers are able to translate those over to the molecular scale and to keep more of the remnants of these discrete levels. As a consequence, there's an incredible strength associated with the optical transitions that occur within these organic molecules. There is an extremely strong absorption of light in these designer molecules. And as a result, one can put down an incredibly thin amount of these materials and still achieve very complete absorption of light. So, for example, if for silicon to achieve complete absorption across the sun's full spectrum can require 100 micrometers of material, a large thickness of semiconductor, some of these organic molecules can achieve within their bandwidth of absorption, can achieve substantially complete absorption within a few dozen nanometers. So they're incredibly strong absorbers, they're incredibly black. Now, the fact that we've concentrated this absorption into this rather narrow band, of course, implies that we're not necessarily addressing the sun's full spectrum. And so we need a strategy in organic photovoltaics to address the sun's full spectrum properly. And here, it's through the mixing of semiconductors having different properties, or it's through the realization of tandem and triple junction solar cells, where each one of these layers consists of a different organic molecule, each tailored to managing a particular portion of the sun's spectrum, that we're able to leverage the very strong absorption of these materials and overcome this limitation of a somewhat more narrowband behavior. Now, there's some very beautiful physics that people working on organic solar cells have also been able to engineer. Really, their solar cells operate on a somewhat different physical principle from the classical junction device, the diode, that's the basis for all electronics, and that's been translated into the photodiode for light sensing and the photovoltaic device for traditional inorganic semiconductor-based photovoltaics. The concept at work in organic photovoltaics that was quite distinctive when it was introduced a little while ago in the 1990s is what's called a donor-acceptor junction. And here, rather than making the semiconductor device out of a single type of semiconductor having two different types of impurities, an electron richness and an electron impoverished quality, instead these organic molecules tend not to be rich in free electrons, but they tend to be very engineerable, such that the energy levels in two different molecules can be matched up such that there is an asymmetry. We talked about the need for an asymmetry to make a good solar cell. They can be matched up such that electrons generated in a first class of molecules, known as the donor, are very efficiently donated to an adjacent molecule that functions as the acceptor. Essentially, when light comes in inside these solar cells, it generates what's known as an exciton, so an excited particle, and that particle ends up being split apart and pulled into the acceptor molecules, and therefore given a much longer lifetime for its extraction of these solar cells. The reason it's so important to extract these energetic charge carriers efficiently in organic solar cells is that the transport properties, the mobilities of electrons inside these materials is much lower than it is in these perfectly regular semiconductors such as silicon or gallium arsenide. And so it's important to find a way station for these excited charge carriers. Rather than have their energy disappear on us before the charges can be extracted, it's important to give ourselves a little bit more time to get the energy out of these devices. And the donor-acceptor junction gives us that. There's also some beautiful engineering that's been done with those donor-acceptor junctions, now not so much in the energetic domain as I was just describing, but in the spatial domain. Researchers figured out how to ensure that the donor and the acceptor could interpenetrate. The problem, if they just made a planar interface between the donor and the acceptor, was that they weren't able to make that device thick enough such that it absorbed all the light and yet also led to the efficient extraction of the energetic electrons. But when they made interpenetrating fingers of donor and acceptor material, they were able to increase the amount of each material that was included, which was very useful in enhancing the absorption of light, but at the same time ensure that wherever an excited electron was generated within the donor, the electrons were very close to an escape hatch. They were very close to one of these energetically favorable interfaces that led to the safe extraction of the charge carrier. And what's so beautiful about these bulk heterojunctions is that to create these nanostructured materials, nanostructured on the scale of 10s, 20s, 30s of nanometers, it wasn't necessary to consciously go in and manipulate matter, define formal fingers using some kind of template or an etching process, but instead the chemists designed these materials such that they liked to segregate. So such that when they just mixed them together and coated them down, that material A was inclined to form a phase of its own, and material B formed an interpenetrating phase, so that they naturally segregated into these kinds of fingers. Now, there's much work that's been done to get these fingers to have these defined properties that are so desired. Clearly, fingers are good, but islands are bad. If we have isolated regions of these organic materials, we're not going to be able to extract the electrons out of them. So much beautiful work has gone into both building these materials such that the phase segregation occurs on the right length scale and leads to a continuous junction where we're able to continually extract the electrons into our acceptor, while at the same time not producing undesired islanding. Solar cells have been made using these organics that stack multiple junctions on top of each other. In fact, there's been some very nice work in recent years in which every single layer, from the electrodes, the conductors, through to the semiconductors, through to the junction that brings together the two or eventually it will be three and more junctions inside one of these solar cells, are all made by spin coating, by solution processing. And so this is now compatible with the realization of organic solar cells that are very low in cost, and yet through the tandem concept, through the better spectral harvesting, compatible also with higher efficiencies. Another way that Nano enters into the organic solar cell is through the constituent materials. In those donor-acceptor junctions, one of the stars of the show is the buckyball. This molecule, which looks just like a soccer ball, is nanometers in size, is responsible for participating in the light absorption and extraction process within these organic solar cells. The buckyballs have a very tunable electronic band structure, and researchers figured out how to make them soluble. In their native state, the buckyballs are not actually soluble in convenient solvents, but researchers were able to attach molecules to the surface of these buckyballs to make them soluble in convenient solvents in order to render them compatible with the attractive features of making an organic solar cell this way. Let's move on to another area that gets back more to the inorganic, to these traditional crystalline semiconductors, and that happens to be the area in which I also work. I work in the field of colloidal quantum dot solar cells. That's what my research group at the university focuses on. We've seen these quantum dots before in some different contexts throughout the course. As a refresher, they're semiconductor particles. They're a few nanometers in size, and they are inorganic crystals. So they're semiconductor particles that have this band structure that we get to tune or define through the quantum size effect, through the size of the particles. And that spectral tunability is one of the features that we've used in various applications throughout. For example, in our discussions of sensing the world through imaging, we've talked about how we're able to tune which colors of light these semiconductor particles absorb in order to see within spectral regimes that are previously unavailable to us using traditional semiconductor approaches. Well, in the context of solar cells, this tunability is also extremely attractive and important. By tuning the size of these particles, by changing their band gap, we change whether they absorb visible or infrared or longer wavelengths of infrared light. And so one of the things that's so appealing in working with these quantum dots as our particle is that, if you think back to the tandem solar cell that we were talking about earlier in today's lecture, there we had to find different materials of different compositions to stack on top of each other, and we had to find some kind of way to match their lattices, match the spacing of their atoms. Well, that was what led to cost and to our discussion of concentrated photovoltaics, which is essentially trying to overcome the challenges and the cost of those devices. But when we work with quantum size effect tunability, we can take a single semiconductor technology based on a single composition of semiconductor. We can master the synthesis and then the processing of devices based on this single semiconductor having a single composition. And then through the quantum size effect alone, through how we change the recipe at the time of the synthesis of these particles, through that method alone, we were able to choose the band gaps. And so with these semiconductor nanoparticles, we have an avenue towards making tandem and triple junction solar cells based on colloidal quantum dots. And just recently, we reported the ability to make a solar cell where the band gaps of the constituent junctions were chosen purely through the quantum size effect to be optimal for the two junctions of a tandem cell. And so this proved the concept that we can really, working with a single material, we can utilize quantum effects to gain dexterity in our control over the band gap without actually having to change the material itself, just with a little tweak to our recipe. One of the beautiful things about these semiconductor nanoparticles is we don't have to limit ourselves to a single shape. We don't have to confine ourselves just to these quantum dots, these semiconductor nanoparticles. But we're also able to make elongated structures, which we refer to as rods. And in these rods, there's clearly a preference for flow along one axis, the long axis. Here we just have a perfect semiconductor crystal that's very compatible with the delocalization of electrons along its length. So these materials have attracted great interest because of their enhanced electronic transport properties. Of course, when you think about what will happen when you take some of these rods out of solution and you coat them onto a substrate, Well, the most likely thing is the rods will lie down in the substrate, and that is exactly what happens. And so now their transport is in the plane, but in all the solar cells that I've been describing, the vertical direction is the one in which we need to extract out the electrons. And so we need some kind of technique to allow these light-absorbing materials to stand up. And there is some beautiful work in which, rather than just making rods, researchers were able to make tetrapods. And so now one had little pointy-up rods with little legs that sat on the ground like little stools, and that became oriented as a result of this geometry. So it combined the fact now that electrons were able to flow along these longitudinal directions through the rod sticking up and then through the legs of the stool. It combined that with this orientation, such that now the direction in which the transport of electrons was the best was also the direction in which transport of electrons was most urgently needed. Another area in which quantum solids have seen great promise and great progress recently is in making solar devices and making materials for solar cells, where we take these quantum particles, we take advantage of their quantum size effect tunability, and we pack them the way eggs are packed into a carton, into what we call a superlattice. We've seen some of these images actually before when we were speaking of nanomotifs. And they're beautiful, and they're also a fascinating exploration in engineering on multiple length scales, because the things that we're building these superlattices from are themselves crystals. We have ordered, oriented atoms on the scale of a ½ nanometer, repeating themselves, again like eggs in a carton, to make up a nanoparticle, say 3 nanometers in diameter. But here, in this transmission electron micrograph, we see many of these identical particles ordering, self-organizing into a perfect lattice themselves. So we have multiple length scales of order, and each of those length scales is important. The first one, the smaller length scale, the arraying of the atoms, ends up achieving the semiconductor properties and the transport properties that we desire. And then the second, the larger length scale of a few nanometers, well, that's the characteristic wavelength of electrons. That's the length scale over which we need electrons to propagate. And so, whereas in the initial work on colloidal quantum dot solar cells, the electron transport has been rather poor and has limited the performance of these solar cells, there's a great sense of optimism that transport associated with coupling these nanoparticles together and packing them into a superlattice can achieve the rest of the progress needed to make these colloidal quantum dot solar cells highly efficient, as well as very convenient to manufacture and correspondingly low in cost. Finally, I'd like to talk about a third class of so-called third-generation solar cells. These are called dye-sensitized solar cells. Dye-sensitized solar cells are really a fascinating convergence of some traditional fields of chemistry, like the electrochemistry that's the basis for batteries, with solar energy harvesting. And the way in which they work is they achieve light absorption using a dye, using a pigment, such as what you'd find in food coloring or to dye clothing with. And these, of course, are very good. These molecules are very good at the absorption of light. But on their own, they're not conductors. And so the insights from the field of dye-sensitized solar cells is that these dyes have been put on essentially a sponge, in the inner surfaces of a sponge, of a semiconductor material that's very good at the transport of electrons. And in fact, the way in which these are built is that this sponge is infiltrated. So the huge surface area of this sponge, a transparent sponge, is used in order to make sure that every pigment, every dye, is directly coupled immediately in immediate proximity to an electron acceptor that can extract the electrons out. And so the concept actually has a relationship to the bulk heterojunction that we were talking about in the case of the organic solar cells, in which we had there this interpenetration of materials. But in both cases, what we're really taking advantage of is our capacity when engineering with nanomaterials to maximize surface areas for beneficial effects in this case. In this case, it's to achieve very strong absorption, and yet to ensure that every one of our dyes, every one of our pigment molecules, is coupled to an electron acceptor. In fact, there's another way in these devices to take advantage of the nano world, which is Instead of making a sponge with kind of packing of spheres together and then tacking the dies onto that, there's been recent work in which one makes a bunch of fingers, an array of fingers, a set of nanowires, and the die is placed onto that, is coupled to that. And now, instead of going through a tortuous path of transport through this set of spheres that are loosely coupled at their junctures, at their points of contact, one has a straight line, one has a direct avenue towards the extraction of photogenerated electrons that are produced inside the pigments, but then are transferred to these elevator shafts that directly transmit the electrons out of the device, the intent being to achieve a maximum of efficiency in the extraction of those electrons. Some of these exciting new technologies are being commercialized, and some of their commercial applications are taking advantage of the attractive properties of physically flexible materials. We can go beyond just thinking about installing these materials on rooftops or integrating them into building materials, though those concepts are exciting in themselves. But things like solar backpacks or mobile phones or tablet devices that are self-charging, or tents in which we're able to achieve energy harvesting. These are all on the near horizon for taking advantage of new breakthroughs in the conversion of energy from the sun into practical electricity.